Oh my gosh, that would be the best story. We ordered our employees to come back to the office 5 days a week, and this is what happened. I would totally read that. Totally read that story.
Okay. Is that the next GeekWire experience?
I think we might have something here. This might be the kind of thing where I wake up tomorrow morning and regret this entire conversation, but we'll check in on it later.
Yeah, for sure. It would be a fascinating experiment.
Yeah, that's one word for it. Hi, and welcome to GeekWire. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop.
And I'm GeekWire editor Taylor Soper.
We are coming to you from Seattle, where we get to report each day on what's happening around us in business, technology, science, startups, and innovation. What happens here matters everywhere, and every week on this show, we talk about some of the most important and interesting stories and trends in the news. This week, Taylor, I've been spending a lot of time digging into the antitrust ruling against Google. And I got to tell you, obviously this is a negative ruling for Google. It was ruled that they're a monopoly that illegally abused their monopoly power to gain competitive advantages over rivals. But this thing is pretty brutal for Microsoft. I know that there's all these hot takes out there saying that this is going to help Microsoft with Bing and all that stuff. But first off, just reading through this, I mean, it's a recap of all of the reasons that Apple says that Bing sucks, first off. I mean, you can't be a Microsoft executive, I would imagine, reading this thinking, oh, this is fantastic. Because it's like the greatest hits of the greatest hits against Microsoft by Apple, and specifically by Eddie Q, one of Apple's senior executives during the case. Let me give you a few highlights from Eddie Q's testimony as recounted in the antitrust ruling against Google. Quote, "I don't believe there's a price in the world that Microsoft could offer us. They offered to give us Bing for free. They could give us the whole company, and Apple still wouldn't do a search deal with Microsoft for the iPhone." And it just struck me reading through this. You take that, plus the fact that this is just simply the findings here, and then the remedies will come later. Google's going to appeal. I saw one expert quoted saying this is going to take 5 years. I mean, it's very hard, in my opinion, despite all of the hot takes out there saying this is good for Microsoft, to see this as anything that is truly meaningful in terms of Microsoft's search market share or its competition with Google. I mean, AI is really Microsoft's last hope here to try and catch up if AI becomes a dominant way for people to search for information online.
I like that take. I think I wrote in our podcast notes here, is Bing back? And clearly, I think, to your point, this is not so much an opportunity or opening for Bing to make a return, but more of a reminder of how much it's not used, I'll say. Not used as much as Google. Pretty damning just to read through how Bing is looked at by competitors and maybe also consumers too. I mean, do you use Bing? I guess if you're using Edge, you may use Bing.
So I do use Edge. I'm a loyal Windows user. I'm no longer using an iPhone. I'm on Android, and I use Google for everything. And I tried at one point, almost just sort of as an exercise in experimentation as part of my beat, to start using Bing on a regular basis. And frankly, that might be a great story coming out of this, dispelling misconceptions. Because I admit I do have misconceptions, and part of it's just familiarity with the Google interface and trust that Google has built up inside me over the years, representative of millions of users around the world, that I'm going to get the best results from them. And so, no, I very rarely use Bing. I have Google set as the default.
It's funny because that was sort of, or at least part of Google's argument in this antitrust case was basically like, well, we're really good and consumers like us.
But to your point, Microsoft would come in here and say, wait a second, one reason why Google is so good is that it gets the feedback from this huge volume of consumer behavior that it can observe to refine its algorithms, improve them. And that's sort of the very point of this antitrust case, is that Google has such a dominant position that it's leveraging it in a variety of different ways to maintain it. And obviously this judge has ruled now that it's doing that unfairly. And Microsoft would say, wait a second, Google's relevance is so much better well, Microsoft wouldn't say that, but to the extent that Microsoft would acknowledge that Google is more relevant, a big reason for that, in Microsoft's view, would be the fact that Google has the advantage of all of this data, and it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that it's the best. It's self-reinforcing. It's a virtuous cycle, which, absent Google's monopoly power, would be a great competitive thing. But when you combine that advantage with monopoly power to extend that monopoly, that's what we're talking about here in this ruling. And to be clear, I mean, this is very consequential for Google, potentially. It's just much further down the road. And then the last thing, to the point that you were making, Taylor, about consumer choice, we saw this happen in Europe with Microsoft and the questions over, I guess it was Internet Explorer at the time. And the EU came out with this browser choice thing where people who logged into Windows, booted up Windows, ran Windows for the first time on their computers, were able to choose in Europe among different browsers. And that is similar to one of the potential remedies in the Google case. And I don't know that it would make a difference. To the point of what we're talking about, you've got these search engines that people are used to. Just because you present me with a menu that includes Bing and DuckDuckGo or whatever else might be added to this, I'm going to pick Google because I know Google. It's like picking IBM back in the day when they were talking about business technology sales. Like, I can't go wrong by picking Google. It's a risk to pick Bing. So I don't know. It's a fascinating ruling, and it's long for anybody who can make it through it. I did use a little bit of AI to help me synthesize it. And I did use Microsoft Copilot for that in the Edge browser. So, hey, maybe there's a silver lining for Microsoft in all this.
You covered the antitrust happenings with Microsoft over 20 years ago, and this is the next big one that we've seen almost 2 decades later. I think we can expect Google to make its way around some of the remedies and figure out a way to survive this, if you will. But it is going to be a distraction. And that was what happened, right, with Microsoft back in the day. And that is what impacted them negatively, was having to deal with the remedies versus the actual details of what they had to change among their products and services. So do you think this is going to hurt Google in that way like it did to Microsoft?
That is a great question. And the short answer is I don't know. And the long answer is I think Google would be wise to learn from what happened to Microsoft here, because this all wraps around. It's all interrelated. One reason why Microsoft missed the mobile revolution, it didn't have the market share in smartphones and had to attempt to get Apple to put Bing on its dominant smartphone platform, was the fact that Microsoft took its eye off the ball. You know, not purposefully. They were trying. Nokia, Windows Phone, they did their best, but you have to ask yourself where they would be if they didn't have that giant distraction in the late 90s, early 2000s of the U.S. antitrust case. That was the Justice Department at the time. I mean, there was a literal breakup order. And that was what Microsoft was facing. Steve Ballmer was going to be going with one half of the company. Bill Gates was going to be going with another. I mean, it's hard to make long-term strategic plans wisely in that context. And here you have Google. I don't know. Frankly, I think the best answer to that question may come at the remedy phase. In other words, the phase where the judge says, okay, now I've made my findings of fact and my conclusions of law. I will now order something to address all of these problems. And I think that's where you might say, okay, at this point, Google's in trouble. And until that point, I think it's hard to say how much of a distraction this might be.
Yeah, and we'll see. And of course, there's all the other big tech companies that are dealing with their own antitrust lawsuits. What kind of impact will the Google ruling have on Amazon, for example? You know, they're in a big fight with the FTC. So it's going to be really interesting to see if this has impact on those cases as well.
If anything, it might be a cautionary tale for Amazon that the aspects of the Google case that are in concept similar to the FTC's case against Amazon might be worth taking another look at and seeing how the judge ruled here and asking themselves, hey, what happens if we get a similar ruling from another judge in that FTC's case, which of course is interesting in part because it's right here in our backyard in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Washington, which is in downtown Seattle. So lots of interesting implications here. I don't know that there's a direct line between what Google is now facing and what Amazon could face in the future, but certainly it's something that Amazon should be paying attention to. Speaking of Amazon, coming up next, we'll talk about the company's relationship with its delivery drivers and how that relationship is getting much more fractured. That's coming up next. All right, Taylor, on another topic related to Amazon and dominance and interactions with key constituencies, I've been paying a lot of attention to Amazon's presence in my own hometown in Northern California. It's a small community called Orland, about 100 miles north of Sacramento on I-5, true Northern California. I won't go down that rabbit hole in that rant, but San Francisco is not actually Northern California. I grew up in Northern California in a small agricultural community where almonds, as they say.
I was going to ask you, almonds, almonds.
Well, I have to change how I say that word depending on who I'm talking to. Back home, they are almonds, and they are the dominant crop. They're the dominant part of the economy. And Amazon came into town about 3 years ago. They established a delivery station on the outskirts of town, and I've been paying close attention to that delivery station, not just for its own sake, but also as a window into everything that's going on in Amazon, especially on the logistics side. It's a delivery station. It was one of the first in rural America. They employ about 200 people directly inside this delivery station. They deliver all across the region, multiple counties. I mean, it's a big swath of the northern Sacramento Valley. And they also, up until recently, had 3 delivery service partners based there. These are the independent companies that actually employ the drivers in the vans and the Amazon uniforms. Those are not actual Amazon employees around the world. Those are DSPs, delivery service partner employees. And they had 3 of them at the Orland delivery station just until recently. And 2 of them, 2 of the 3, went out of business. 170 drivers in a town of about 8,200 people. I mean, it's pretty significant piece of news. It also points to some larger conflicts. Not all of them exactly the same, but there's lots of tension nationally and globally between Amazon and these delivery service partner companies. There's more than 3,500 of them around the world. And to me, it was just a fascinating window, essentially, in a nutshell, and I'll link to the story from the show notes, but Amazon overloaded these drivers. Amazon's algorithms overloaded the drivers on these routes. And especially in rural parts of the country where there's lots of ground that these people have to cover, even a few extra stops can make or break a driver for the day and determine whether or not they're going to actually finish the job. In some cases, Amazon was adding like 50 stops to a route that had 100 previously. So like went from 100 to 150 in one case, a driver I spoke with. And it also fundamentally changed the economics for at least one of these DSPs to where they weren't getting the job done to the point where they could claim full revenue from Amazon, or to get the job done, they had to pay excessive overtime to these drivers. The DSPs, one of them told me that he tried to get Amazon to address this and couldn't, and ultimately had been operating at a loss since March of this year and threw in the towel, just couldn't make it work, was not willing to make the sacrifices in driver safety, because to do these routes, a lot of these folks would have to literally run. And he was just saying, no, not going to do it. If I can't make money having my drivers operate safely, I'm not going to do it. They're done. So 170 jobs done. Not a big deal from Amazon's perspective. I mean, certainly a hiccup, but they're able to just say, okay, next DSP up, essentially. So the next delivery service partner, they've got people in the pipeline, independent entrepreneurs who want to go in and give it a shot. And the thing that I think should be concerning is when it becomes clear to those DSPs what they have to do to get the packages delivered and make money, are they going to make the safety trade-offs that this DSP that I spoke to declined to do? So lots going on here, a real window through my hometown into the broader world of Amazon, except for the fact that Amazon, for its part, I'll link to the story where they give you the statement, that Amazon says this is not representative of what's happening elsewhere. I will tell you, based on the emails I've gotten from other DSPs across the country, I think that statement from Amazon needs to be scrutinized closely, and I am continuing to look into this story.
Yeah, your reporting on this has been just fantastic. I love that it's in your hometown. You know the town, the vibe, and you know Amazon. I mean, you covered Amazon for years, and we've been tracking Amazon's growth in e-commerce and how they deliver packages and how they're doing more on their own, less so reliant on the UPS, FedEx, USPSs of the world. One stat in your story, there are now more than 3,500 of these DSP companies that deliver 20 million packages daily in 19 countries. I mean, this is massive. It's a massive part of their logistics operation, and it's important for Amazon to make sure these relationships are working. And so this got me thinking about how Amazon handles their warehouse workers, how Amazon deals with third-party sellers on their platform. Of course, this is different and has its own unique attributes with DSP companies being their own entities, etc. But really fascinating look at the dynamics for here, and just great reporting, Todd.
I think the relationship to the sellers is very similar to what you're talking about here with the DSPs. Independent companies that make their living on Amazon's infrastructure and live or die by the policies and procedures and little changes that Amazon makes in the rates and the practices, very dependent on Amazon. And that is one question. There's actually a congressional inquiry into this. And the issue is whether Amazon is truly allowing these companies to operate independently. I mean, there are a lot of questions about that, because one advantage Amazon has here with these delivery service partners is it's not liable. In other words, if there's an accident or other issues, I mean, these DSP owners operate the fleets of vehicles, and they also employ the drivers. So much of the liability is put on them versus Amazon, and yet Amazon is able to exercise tons of control directly and indirectly over their businesses. So there's a congressional inquiry into whether Amazon is getting the best of both worlds there through this relationship. It's got both Bernie Sanders and J.D. Vance signed on. So if there's anything that's going to unite this country, apparently it's Amazon.
That is the definition of bipartisan. And we haven't even gotten into this, but the rural aspect of this, like the battle for rural America among retail and e-commerce, and this is part of Amazon's push into the rural part of the U.S., as you mentioned in your story, setting up these delivery stations beyond cities where they have a pretty good grip and really amping up the competition with Walmart.
Absolutely. And to your point, I'll give you one example. My mom likes to get paper. She likes to get, stacks of paper from, it used to be Office Depot. And for her, when she needed a new supply of paper for printing, they used to go to Chico, which is 20 miles away, to the Office Depot. Amazon's delivery speeds have gotten so much better. I mean, it used to be 3-4 days prior to this delivery station being there. Their delivery speeds have gotten so much better. You can typically get that kind of thing in 1 or 2 days in rural America, in these small towns, if there's a nearby delivery station. And so there's much less incentive to drive to the nearby urban hub. There's a Walmart 20 miles away the other direction, much less incentive to go there. When I'm visiting in town, if I forgot my swim trunks or something, hey, I'll just, order it on Amazon. Whereas in the past, I would have driven down to Willows, to the Walmart in Willows, not to get too local on you there. But this has changed things. And this is all part of what Andy Jassy and the whole crew, Doug Harrington at Amazon, are trying to do with Amazon's e-commerce operations. They want it to be so much easier, so much faster for you to get products via Amazon. And then they also want it to be cheaper. So that's where this drive for efficiency, the lower cost to serve that Andy Jassy talked about on the company's most recent earnings, trickles down into the culture. And you can see where Amazon is trying to wring every bit of inefficiency out of the delivery routes to save costs. I think there's a disconnect. The delivery service provider owners talk to the people locally. The people locally, are they really going to stand up and challenge the people in Seattle at headquarters or Arlington, Virginia, wherever Amazon is based these days? Unlikely. If you're a person out in the field, unlikely. And the Orland delivery station has had 3 site leads in 3 years. And I think that's telling. Well, first off, Amazon is promoting them, and that's to their credit. But also, they don't really have the long-term credibility and authority that somebody who might have been in that position for a longer period of time would have had to go up against the likes of the folks at the Day One Tower in downtown Seattle on issues like this. And I think it's just going to be one of those situations where until there's real consequences for Amazon corporate, you're not going to see much in the way it changes.
Next time you're back home in Orland, I want to see a GeekWire experience story, ordering almonds. Did I say that right?
No, almonds. Almonds, yes.
Almonds and a couple packs of paper, and drive out to the Walmart and then order on Amazon and see which one's faster.
Hey, that is a great idea. That is a great idea. And to me, this has been so much fun, in part because, I've been covering Amazon in its hometown, along with you and everybody else at GeekWire, for almost 15 years now. And it's so much fun to be able to go to my own hometown. And I do feel, not to use a sports analogy, but I do feel like I have a bit of a home field advantage in this particular instance because, I hang out with these people at the Orland Bowl. I see them at Farwood's restaurant, I learned things about Amazon in this situation. And it was interesting interacting with the Amazon representatives on this story. And I told them, I said, hey, don't BS me here. I know what's going on.
Yeah, can't wait to see the future stories. And I love the home field advantage and the impact that a tech giant can have, not just on Seattle where it's based, but in a small place like Orland.
All right, let's bring it back home. When we come back, let's talk about the city of Seattle's RTO mandate, return to office, that really had people talking this past week in our backyard. You're listening to GeekWire, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. It's Todd Bishop with Taylor Soper. All right, Taylor, this is the story of the decade, I think, writ large. When you think about remote work, the pandemic, the post-pandemic period, how people interact with each other in the office, the mandates to come back to the office. And that's what we saw this past week with the city of Seattle. Mayor Bruce Harrell is now ordering employees to come back 3 days a week as opposed to 2 days a week. Have I got that right?
Yes, from 2 to 3. Doesn't really seem like a huge difference, but I think there's a ton of backlash within city employees. A big part of this is, at least according to the mayor and city officials, is to help revitalize downtown. Seattle downtown has certainly not come back the way other cities have out of the pandemic. And a lot of folks are saying we need workers down there. We need people buying lunch. We need people going to happy hour. And so part of this, I think, is to try to increase activity downtown, get that sales tax up. Other reasons that Mayor Harrell outlines in his press release was that collaboration. I think we hear that a lot too. So I've been hearing there's a lot of pushback within the city and the workers there about this mandate to come in more. Similar to what we've seen with tech companies and Amazon, for example, putting their own mandates in and then seeing that pushback from the workforce.
Our colleague Kurt Schlosser was down in the Pioneer Square area, I got the sense, south downtown. And one of the points he made, he was, by the way, testing the new Lime scooters, the seated Lime scooters, which is another great story, by the way, which we'll link to.
Lime Glider.
Lime Glider, thank you. His point was there's a huge difference between south downtown and north of downtown, the South Lake Union and the Denny Triangle areas where Amazon has its headquarters. And you can see where the city would be saying, like, wait a second, we want all these businesses to be bringing back their employees for the majority of the week. Like, we got to walk the talk. And so I can understand that. But the problem is, what year is this? 2024? When did the pandemic start?
2020.
2020. I mean, that's 4 years of ingrained habits. And once you've got the habits down, the routines of working at home, man, it's tough to break those kinds of habits.
Yeah. And so what is this about, right? Like 2 to 3, it really doesn't seem like a big difference. It seems like this is more of maybe a statement they're making. In the press release they put out, Amazon had a quote. I don't know the last time I've seen that. Amazon having a quote in the city of Seattle's press release.
Wow.
Amazon saying they supported this idea. Another important thing to note is that the city is facing a massive budget deficit heading into next year. And so one theory we saw around Amazon's RTO was that this was a way to, show the door to folks to cut costs. And so I don't know, maybe this is a similar strategy that the city of Seattle is employing.
This is also an equity issue, Taylor. There was the executive director of one of the unions that represents more than 3,300 City of Seattle workers. And she said that they firmly believe that increasing in-office minimums has a disproportionate and negative impact on working families, particularly for women and people of color with dependent care responsibilities. Another parallel to what we heard when Amazon was going through this, very similar. There, the risk is if this does cause some attrition in the workforce, then your workforce becomes less diverse in the process, which is clearly not something that the city would want. By the way, for people who were wondering why we were so amazed that Amazon would be in a City of Seattle press release, I mean, was it 3 years ago, 4 or 5? Amazon and the prior administration and the prior city council in Seattle were, to say they were at odds would be an understatement. Taxes, fundamentally, there was a huge disconnect. And you covered a housing announcement just recently where Mayor Harrell and Andy Jassy were both there.
Yeah, they were, kind of high-fiving, talking to each other for 5-10 minutes. It's a vast contrast to what this relationship used to be. And hey, maybe they're coming together over RTO.
Hey, Taylor. Thanks for chatting.
Good to be here. See you next week.
Until next time, I'm Todd Bishop.
I'm Taylor Soper.
We'll be back soon with a new episode of the GeekWire Podcast.